measurement. So Dave Sullivan made a great point. I just want to emphasize it. Dave Sullivan talked about, and he used derivatives, and he probably used derivatives for a few reasons. One, a lot of disclosures, but two, derivatives are remeasured. So you could have a situation where there are no new derivatives, and the company has not gotten out of any derivatives, but you may have a material change on the reported financial statements, and is that something? So I've created a distinction between transactions and measurement, and that would be important, I think, for the board to know. When we're talking about the red flag approach, is it only new or change in transactions, or is it also a change in measurement of existing transactions? Fair, Dave? Yeah.
So my reaction reading through this is whether any of this is intended to change how this applies to nonprofit organizations with public debt. And when you look at most not-for-profits with public debt who do disclose summarized financial information according to their covenants, most don't do any of this, and they don't feel that the existing language is applicable. A few of the larger health systems have, and you will see financial statements that look and incorporate these items. But I don't know if this change is intended to create clarity on that, because if it's going to bring in nonprofits with publicly traded debt, this would be a significant change for that part of the industry that most are not prepared to do today. And so that's just the point I wanted to bring up.
John.
I guess first just a technical drafting question. In the first place, the first paragraph where you've got all the underlined, I'm trying to understand what the time frame is, because it says if there has been a significant event or transaction that has a material effect. Do we mean during the period? Do we mean something that hasn't been previously disclosed? I mean, say the event occurs in January and it's reflected in the annual financials. I mean, I feel like you need a time frame in there. And I guess related to that, when I go to the AA paragraph, if you end up with disclosures in the first quarter, as read, you have to repeat them in the second and third quarter. Is that, I mean...
I've always understood that, so to answer your second question first, I've always understood that the quarterly notes are an update of the previous annual. So I'm not thinking that by the time I get to the third quarter, I have 4 reports in front of me and I'm looking for the relevant piece of information across all 4. I always thought it was between the previous year end and the third quarter. At least that's the way I used to prepare financial statements, that I was only levering off of the 2. So yes, there was a build effect, if you would. That's how. I
mean, if we're trying to reduce repetition, having to repeat it 3 times doesn't reduce repetition. But I do think you need some sort of time frame up in the first one. Going to what Russ's comments, and I think Russ was right on. Just by analogy, lawyers worry a lot about risk factors, and the structure that the SEC now has set up for risk factors are you put extensive risk factors in your 10K, and then you are required to update them in your 10Q only if you have a material change. Or you can repeat them entirely. But every time when you have changes, if you have small changes, you just wrestle over and over, is that material, isn't it material? Because if you decide that it's material, or if you repeat it, it's kind of sitting there by itself in the 10Q. And so for companies that repeat all of their risk factors every quarter, it is much easier to make, I will say in some ways, better disclosure, because you can make smaller changes and bring them up to date without kind of making an admission that they're material, which often you don't like to do. While if you follow the structure of having all of them in the 10K and only put it in the 10Q if you've reached the decision that it's material, often you don't get as many updates. And of course, that suggests a whole lot more words, but it just makes that is what has developed in the risk factor world, and it's somewhat analogous here.
Rudy.
All right, family. You got to understand how this stuff all kind of ties in. Now, I'm going to go back to what I was saying about the currency transaction reports and so forth to give some clarity. So, therefore, everybody's on point. We're going to start with actually what FinCEN is and what it isn't. What is FinCEN? Well, FinCEN actually stands for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FinCEN. Okay, so what is FinCEN? All right, I'll just give it to you from this perspective so you can really get it. Give me a second here. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network today released a new strategy analyst of the Banking Secrecy Act, which is called the BSA. So whenever you hear us say BSA, we're talking about the Banking Secrecy Act. And it deals with reporting and indicating that elders face an increased threat to their financial security by both domestic and foreign actors. Domestic and foreign actors. Elders' financial exploitations, suspicious activity report, which is called SARS, filings increased drastically over the 6-year study period from 2,000 filings per month in 2013 and reaching a peak of nearly 7,500 per month. FinCEN in New York focuses on virtual currency. On May 3rd, 2019, representatives from virtual currency money transmitters and other money services businesses, third-party service providers, federal government agencies, a federal task force, and several depository institutions gathered at a FinCEN exchange session in New York City to discuss the threats and opportunities presented by virtual currencies. The FinCEN Exchange is a volunteer program established in 2017, created by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to convene law enforcement and financial institutions from across the country to share information. 5G. FinCEN Exchange topics generally included methods to identify vulnerabilities, disrupt terrorists and proliferation financing, and guard against other financial crimes. Sharing information through these public-private partnerships support more and higher quality reports to FinCEN and assist law enforcement in detecting, preventing, and prosecuting terrorism, organized crime, money laundering, and other financial crimes. Sharing information also assists the financial institutions in prioritizing their efforts. One of these FinCEN top priorities is strengthening public-private partnerships to mitigate threats and vulnerabilities in the U.S. financial system. Taking advantage of FinCEN's mandate from Congress to foster appropriate information flow between and among financial sector actors. They keep calling these guys actors. And the government is particularly important in a fast-moving area such as virtual currency, where law enforcement and industry can both provide each other with greater context for the type of transactions each is seeing. Says the financial, what does FinCEN stand for again? The financial, they're engaged into watching these institutions that deal in currency transactions. It is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. See, FinCEN is watching all of these currency transaction reports. And when your accounting isn't properly submitted to the Department of Treasury, you become what you fear. And the Banking Secrecy Act forces these corporations, because commerce is corporate, for incorporations that operate corporately in commerce. Trade is for companies, and both have a public side and private side, which is what? Being distinguished by the FinCEN Group. The financial, I done said it 3 times, I'll say it one more time. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So when you can't produce a CTR, you are directly on the radar with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That's why you want to ask these institutions that are in commerce to produce their currency transaction reports, because under the Banking Secrecy Act, as a competent trustee, you have a right to ask for that information. And when they can't produce that information, listen to what this says. Okay, taking advantage of FinCEN's mandate from Congress to foster appropriate information flow between and among financial sectors, actors, and government is particularly important in fast-moving areas such as virtual currency, where law enforcement and industry can both provide each other with greater context for the type of transactions each is seeing, said FedCEN Director Kenneth A. Blocko. This